I sat down with Dr. Brooks Agnew in Trout Lake, Washington, to discuss the ecological, economic, and societal implications this event will have on the United States and the international community.
A few years ago, a similar situation happened in Russia. Of course, not on the ocean, 5,000 feet, but it had happened on land, and they were able to contain the spill. Have we approached the Russians to quote unquote pick their brains?
I don't know if we have or not. I know Russia's one of the OPEC nations. They're one of the great oil producers. This is not the greatest oil spill that we've ever had. We've had spills in Southern California, for instance, that were 100,000 barrels a day that literally filled an entire valley with oil. People were rowing boats across it. They were pumping oil into trucks for months and months until the geyser finally quit. And then all that oil was pumped up, and then the soil was simply bulldozed over, and now there's houses there today. That was probably the worst oil spill in U.S. history. That and the original geyser that happened down in Texas that started the whole oil rush down there in the late 1800s. But this is the worst oil spill at sea. And it has some special hazards to it because the opening to the well is a mile deep in the water. This makes it inaccessible to any kind of manned vehicle except maybe a special two-man sub. And there have been some suggestions, and this is quite frustrating to me, because the way to plug this well is to put pump casing or pump pipe down into that hole several hundred feet and pump concrete into that hole. But to try to hit an 8 to 10 inch pipe from a mile up above is like trying to drop a thread in through a needle from the top of a room. You need to have some kind of craft right at the opening of that well to grab that pipe and feed it into the hole. Now that would be a very leading edge solution that the oil companies have never tried. And it's pretty widely known that all of the techniques that the oil companies are using right now to stop the oil from coming out of that hole have failed repeatedly many times all over the world. They have never worked. What they have usually done is wait for the geyser to play out. In other words, the gas drive to come off of the well so that it finally stops blowing like a volcano. Or they have drilled in from the sides and pumped concrete in. That's only been successful in water up to 500 feet deep, not 5,000 feet deep.
What happens if this continues to spill? And I don't know how many barrels of oil may be under the 5,000 feet, but what is causing down there? Is there a possibility that water may come in contact with the heated bottom, if you will, and cause a massive steam explosion?
There is a risk if the pressure comes off of this well that gases that are currently in liquid form underneath there would reach a low enough pressure point to where they would flash to gas. If that happens, you could see a supervolcano kind of explosion where this liquid doesn't flash off a little bit at a time. It flashes off suddenly and cataclysmically.
I hate to even fathom of how this scenario could pan out. But take us to that scenario. If this happens, how can we watch a movie in our mind's eye?
Well, to draw a comparison, many people are familiar with the latent supervolcano underneath Yellowstone. This is a very similar situation. You have a lot of gases that are under pressure. They're liquefied deep underneath Yellowstone. If that were to breach somehow, and the pressure were to lower to the point to where that liquid could flash to gas, it would expand to at least 1,000 times its volume. The supervolcano would be enough to spread ash all the way to the eastern side of Nebraska. So if this were to happen in the Gulf of Mexico, I would think we would probably lose the Gulf of Mexico as a viable ecology.
What about the populations of the area, the tsunami? How big can a wave come towards the shores of Florida, for example?
If you had an explosion of that size, less than 50 miles off the coast, you would have, less than 10 minutes warning. You would have a tsunami maybe 150 feet high.
And about 300 miles per hour?
It could be 300 miles an hour if the shock wave is strong enough, but even 75 miles an hour would be devastating.
How far inland would a wave that size go?
Well, there are no natural barriers down there, so a tidal wave of 75 to 100 feet high, traveling at 100 miles an hour, would probably go 20 miles inland. A storm surge from a hurricane is only a few feet, and you saw what Katrina did. We're talking about a sudden wall of water, not a storm surge. This would turn 20 miles of coastline into a sandbar.
And I hate to even start the conspiracy part of this, but it's no longer a conspiracy in my opinion. We look at the presidents. We look at Goldman Sachs selling 44% of their BP shares. We see Wachovia, which is owned by Wells Fargo, sold 97% of their shares. Other private asset management companies sold 90-some% of their BP shares. The CEO, Tony Hayward, sold 1/3 of his shares and paid his mansion in Kent, England. How can all these companies do this unless they have some sort of knowledge of what was coming?
Well, that's a really good question, and the trail doesn't end there. You have Transocean that shortly before this disaster doubled the insurance on Deepwater Horizon, which is the rig that's had this problem. They made $270 million on this disaster just from the payoff of the insurance. You had BP purchasing Boots & Coots, which is a specialty company that only specializes in rig fires. They're the ones that put out 30% of the fires in Iraq when Gulf War I. They also had a lot of experience in ocean rig fires and in plugging ocean rig leaks. So this is not a highly profitable company, but it's a highly specialty, skilled for emergency services company. It's so strange that all of the events that you just described and the one that I added to it took place within a 3 to 4 month period prior to this occurring. Now, this is a tremendous amount of money, about $500 million that changed hands prior to this disaster happening. What it leads the world to believe is it is a disaster, true enough, but it was no accident.